Yes.
Okay, I think we are live and recording, because, just in case. And ready to go. Except there's my remote. This is the last in this series on political theology. And so next week we make a pivot and begin two new series. Jerry, do you want to mention something about what you'll be teaching? But you asked to do that, right?
Yes.
Can you come up here, though, so that people who are live streaming can... Nope.
Does this mean I can have a whole hour?
No.
Is it working?
Nope.
It's inverted.
Well, I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah, so the words are backwards, but.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
yeah,
I'll fix that.
usually
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and start. I'll be teaching the next 5 or 6 or 8 weeks, I'm not real sure how long, in the book of 1 Timothy. Timothy was the pastor at the church at Ephesus. We have more written about that particular church than any other church in the New Testament, from its founding in Acts, book of Ephesians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and the epilogue in Revelations. So next week, what I want to do is go through the whole history of the church so we have context for 1 Timothy, which we'll start the week after. I have to start with an apology. I grew up BC before computers. So I don't know how to do a PowerPoint. If anybody wants to teach me, you can, because I probably ought to learn. But there's an advantage to that. I'm going to use handouts. And that's what I want to... you can take it home, you can read it again. And you can even prepare for next week. So what I want to do now is hand out some handouts for next week. It's just the history of the church and a couple questions, and we'll go over that next week. So that's what we'll be doing. See you next Sunday.
And Jerry, can I have one of those?
Sure.
Do I have your permission to put this online?
Sure.
Okay.
Now keep the folders because I'll continue to hand things out.
Okay, I think our words are not inverted anymore, right?
Correct.
Okay, so Jerry will be in this room doing 1 Timothy. I will have the handouts scanned and put up onto the website on the ACG page. And Jerry, we're going to record yours.
So I'm not live.
Right, you're not live. Okay. And then...
It doesn't make a big difference.
Yeah, except I can just record with a camera, and I can take all my gear to do the... So it is a good load of gear. Oh my word. Okay. So, there. Let's try this again. There we go. Okay. And I will be doing the book of Micah next door, and that one will be live streamed. I can't say anything about the book of Micah yet because I haven't started studying. So that'll be my work next week. And that is Jerry's. So when you're looking for these on the YouTube channel, those are the thumbnails. Okay. Any questions about where we're at, kind of things that we've talked about so far that you need clarification? I'm going to try and help us put some rubber on the road this morning, talking about kind of two kingdoms theology and how that might apply. But was there any burning questions raised in the last couple weeks? Okay.
I had plans to write you a big email and I never did.
Okay. Filled with questions?
Yeah.
Okay, well please keep them in mind and as we're going if they come up or if I don't answer them.
Yeah, I just had this question about, do we really all share a common good that is the same as each other?
Great
And
question.
If so, what's the basis of it?
Okay, great.
Can we go to that basis for any kind of things that we do in terms of legal, political, government things? Can we,
Good.
whatever that basis is, that seems to be like whatever we should be going to.
Okay. We are going to talk about that this
Okay.
morning. Bill's
Okay.
question was a great one. Is there a common understanding of the good if I'm putting words in your mouth, putting my words, that we can kind of, I keep talking about working towards the common good.
Yeah.
Is there a common vision of what that good looks like? And so we will talk about that. I don't think we'll answer it, but I'll give you some different opinions on that. So, okay. As I've been reflecting on the last couple of weeks, I've realized I haven't been careful enough with some of my language. So I want to make sure that, my wife would say that all the time, I'm not careful enough with my language. Need to go back and kind of make a couple distinctions that I don't know that I've been careful enough to maintain. When we're talking about the question, should we be involved in politics? It depends on who the we is. If the we is the church as the institution, I would say no. If the we in the statement is us Christians individually, I would say absolutely, we should be. So I kind of would reflect an Anabaptist when it comes to the church, but when I'm talking about individual Christians, I would say yes, we can and ought to be involved. Okay? So I would not at all be in favor, I think I said this last week, of putting a yard sign on the church property, Trump or Biden, but, at my house, I might. Okay? Yes?
So the church institutionally being involved in politics, so right there you said, you kind of made a distinction to partisan politics. So the church shouldn't endorse one politician. But it seems
Correct.
like institutional churches make statements on moral issues or all the time, and
Great.
that can be an important witness.
Okay. Stay with
Okay.
me.
Okay.
Yep, good. And if I don't answer that, ask again.
Okay.
Okay, but I hope I do. Okay. Broadly, I don't think the church should involve itself in partisan politics or in making policy recommendations or candidate endorsements or advocating for political parties. That doesn't mean we shouldn't speak to issues that are deemed political. Okay? For example, here at the church, we have talked about environmental stewardship. That shouldn't necessarily be a political thing, right? As Christians, we're called to steward all of our gifts, including our natural resources. And yet, in the climate of today, it's become a political issue. You could go down a whole list of things like that. That doesn't mean we're not going to speak to things that aren't political. If we say that we're not going to speak to anything that is political, we're allowing the world to limit what we will and will not talk about. Does that make sense? Okay. It also doesn't mean we won't call out sin. Both of these sentences have double negatives. I think you can follow that, right? Doesn't mean we won't call out sin even in our political leaders. I think we can call out gross immorality. I think John could have, would have, probably in a way did call out, the immorality of Nero and things like that. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but here we do have to understand that calling out sin in our government officials can't mean holding up their policies to the light of the kind of morality the church is held to. Does that make sense?
Okay, so we're gonna keep your definition of politics is partisan politics.
It's not my definition, but
That's
it
what
does
we're
include
describing.
partisan politics.
Because if you make a statement like, but the church just north of us puts out crosses in its yard, about abortion, that is a very political statement.
Sure, absolutely.
Um,
So here's
but it didn't used to be partisan, but it maybe
Yeah.
now, but
So I'll pick that issue as
Okay.
a for instance. I think the church ought to preach about the sanctity of life and the immorality of abortion. I don't know that the church should make policy statements about we ought to overturn Roe v. Wade or we ought to do this. The church, frankly, doesn't have enough, it's not equipped to advocate for public policies. We don't have the expertise in knowing how to advocate for foreign policy or domestic public policy. We're not economists. We're not the things that are required to make good public policy, we're not equipped for that. We're theologians and Bible scholars, and we understand how that comes to bear in life. But as an institution, we're not that. We don't have the foresight to know, no one does, all the unintended consequences of a policy decision. So I think we can preach against immorality of, or the morality of, the sanctity of, but I would be adverse to making policy recommendations. So along these lines, a Christian who's a judge, who, for instance, rules in favor to protect the free speech of a pornographic magazine, isn't sinning, right? Now, that same Christian judge who takes the pornographic magazine home with them to read, is. There's a distinction there. Follow me with that? Disagree?
Follow you, that just is, that's tough speed bumps to hit.
Sure. Yeah, and it's part of understanding that we, the nation, no nation, is a Christian nation. So,
And that's like, the Supreme Court nominee.
right.
Will she follow the Constitution, or will she follow her faith, and what happens when those things maybe don't match?
Right.
And that is a great example.
Yep. So, when I talk about this, the church shouldn't speak on issues it deems political. Make sure you understand me to hear say that the institutional church. Abraham Kuyper was kind of famous for this idea of sphere sovereignty. And, in different spheres, there's different sovereigns. Me in the home, I'm sovereign there. But if I go to the workplace and my son is my boss, he might be sovereign there. Or if he's the mayor of the town, or a sheriff or something, he'd be sovereign there. And he was very much insistent that the church as an institution not involve itself in politics. But he also encouraged Christians to form, he didn't use the word, I don't think, parachurch groups that would be influential in politics. So they weren't the church as an institution, but it was an economist from there, and an economist from there, and a political scientist from there, and hey, we can come together and think about how our faith informs decisions. They do have the expertise. Bob and I certainly don't. Bill.
Okay, I'm gonna throw out this, so in the 60s, during the era of civil rights,
Yep.
the church definitely, like Southern, African American churches definitely did speak out in political ways.
Sure.
If they hadn't, you could read that as being endorsement of the status quo.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
how do you reconcile that with church shouldn't be involved in politics?
Yeah. I think there are rare instances. The confessing church in Germany, speaking out against the evils of Hitler's regime. The church in the South, pre-Civil War, ought to have spoken with a clarion voice against the evils. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would be speaking politically, though. They could be in their church speaking against the evils of slavery and bringing people under church discipline for practicing slavery. But I would say that is probably...
Some churches did.
What's that?
And there were some churches.
There were some, absolutely. There were some. And that you have divisions between PC, Presbyterian Church of America, the Southern Presbyterian. You have all kinds of divisions because some churches were insisting that no, we won't hire missionaries that are slave owners. No, so that was happening. It would have been better had it been more consistent, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think there are those rare instances where the policy is so evil that it ought to be called out.
So how do you
But
decide
rare.
So, what is so?
Yeah,
If it's, is it against the Ten Commandments? Is it against,
Yep.
where is that?
Yep. I don't know. And I think that's where each generation, each institution has to prayerfully under the guidance of the Holy Spirit with wisdom make those calls. That make sense?
So broadly, I do not think the
Right.
church should
Exactly.
usually involve
That's my
itself.
fudge word, right? That's my little bit of wiggle room. Even, I'll just be honest, even on the issue of abortion, I am
Yeah.
about as pro-life as you can get. I don't know that the church so advocating for the overturn of Roe v. Wade has been that beneficial in the long run. There's been plenty of studies that say that's not the best solution to, if you want to reduce the number of abortions,
Support women.
support women.
Yeah.
So I don't have the expertise or the wisdom or the research skills to know, which is the best option. But I will speak about the evil of abortion. Okay?
Okay.
Let me keep going. We're probably making a lot of my future sides slightly irrelevant now, because we've talked about them already. But so I think I've said that ad nauseum, right? Okay. And we as Christians, I want to affirm this. This is the kind of contra the Anabaptist position. We should absolutely be involved in politics seeking the common good. Stay with me, I know. Okay, seeking the common good. Yes, that involves coercive elements, right? Politics does, but that's part of our world as we live in it now, and we're not to withdraw from it entirely.
So, side question from Nate that could take us down a side question.
Okay.
When a church in America speaks out on a political issue, does it disqualify itself from nonprofit status from a legal standpoint?
So I've already said, right, that I don't have all the qualifications to answer. I don't have the. In theory, yes, it does. In practice, that hasn't been true. A family member was a pastor of a church, and they would regularly host Republican candidates to speak, and they would promote them, and they never lost their status.
Wow.
Under the law, I think they probably were in jeopardy of losing that, but I think it's been something that agents have been reluctant to enforce. Agents, I don't know who those government agents, but okay. Is there a question percolating?
I kind of have, okay, so what about this idea that, and the church discipline thing that you brought up, maybe think about this more. So in Christ's time, the Jewish church operated within the Roman government.
Right.
And the Roman government had all kinds of things that were against what they would have advocated for, right?
Yep.
And so if you look at it like that, could it be, I'm postulating totally, that
Absolutely.
if the civil government does not restrict individual rights of freedom to choose,
Okay.
that would be consistent with God not making us, but giving us freedom to choose.
Okay.
What do you think of that?
Yep. Stick with me.
Okay.
Yep. We're gonna talk about rights here in just a minute, and it's gonna
All
I
right,
think
all right.
address that. No, you're good. You're good. Another distinction. That was our first pair of distinctions. Another distinction was birthed out of a question you asked, Jerry. I think last week. You said, and I'm paraphrasing. What should we expect of our government? Should we hold them morally accountable? And I think there's a difference between what should we expect of our government as a system and what should we expect of our elected officials. I would hold our elected officials to a higher bar than I hold our system in general. In fact, I hold my kids to a higher bar than I hold all students at RBB, to a bar, because I'm in relationship to my kids. I'm in relationship to the government officials that I have elected, so I can, and I think I'm legitimately obligated to hold them to a higher bar. That doesn't mean I hold them to a Christian bar. Okay? I'm not going to enforce with my vote even that they attend a certain kind of church or that they attend church at all, but I will expect a certain level of morality from them. Okay? So I think that's an important distinction. All right, I'm going to keep going. Last week I talked about the idea of the secular kingdom, and I think most of us have almost a knee-jerk reaction to that word secular. It's not a bad word though. Don't confuse it with secularism. When I'm using the word secular, I just use it to mean kind of the common kingdom that we share even with unbelievers and Muslims and Buddhists and atheists. Okay? Secularism is a more militant kind of ideology that looks for religion in the public sphere and tries to stamp it out everywhere it sees it. That's not what when I advocate for a secular kingdom, I'm not saying we have to cease all God talk and we don't have to stop supporting our claims with God talk in our religious beliefs. But it's a common kingdom and we have to understand that. We share it with others. I think that it's best to think of a threefold kind of distinction. On the illegitimate end, you have the profane. On the extremely legitimate end, you have the holy. And then there's this space in between. I don't want to call it neutral because it's still under God, but it's not holy. And I think you see that even in Old Testament Israel. Right? The whole nation itself was a holy nation. And so there's a sense in which you could describe it as holy. But even in that sphere, there was elements that were deemed common and some that were deemed sacred. So, just a silly example, there was sacred tongs that were reserved for, the altar. The priesthood was a holy, sacred priesthood. Not everyone was called to that. And so it's, I think, an important distinction. Now, someone might object, yeah, but now this side of the cross, all of life is for God's glory. Therefore, it's all worship and it's all holy. And I agree with that. But that would be true even of Israel, right? There's never been a time where all of life hasn't been for God, or at least supposed to be lived before God, and holy in that sense. But that doesn't mean there aren't divisions between what is technically sacred and what is technically secular or common. So that some would complain that promotes a dualism. We don't have time to get into that, so I'm just going to skip past it. Others would say, well, no, we need a Christian approach to politics. And my response is the Christian approach to the political sphere is to keep it a secular sphere, common for everybody. That is the Christian approach. Okay? So I'm not advocating that we set aside our faith. I'm saying this is what our faith kind of mandates in the political kingdom, that we keep it common for everybody. Okay, I'm seeing a little bit of I'm not so sure. Okay, this is the opposite of theocracy, right? Okay. Okay. So, I know that as children of the Reformation, we love the idea of the priesthood of all believers, and I really do. But that doesn't mean that everything we do is holy, it doesn't mean that everything we do is holy. There are some things that are very mundane. It's a reformer word. And there's mundane and then there's holy. They did say every vocation is really a vocation. It's done before God. It's done in service to God and in service to neighbor. But they didn't just kind of flatten everything either. I think that's important to realize. Okay. Pause. This is, I hope, going to be a little bit easier to wrestle with. We've done this before, but Israel technically, they were a theocracy, right? There's no doubt that what they established was specific to them. They were to be a holy nation, and the laws that they had were directly handed to them from God in the Mosaic Code. Even then, God was still sovereign and ruling over the affairs of foreign nations, right? He wasn't only sovereign and king over Israel. You see, for example, he sends Jonah to Nineveh, right? Because the evil in Nineveh had risen up to God and they needed to be warned. So he's still sovereign over everything, but he has a specific way of ruling over Israel that is different than the way he's ruling over all the other nations. No nation today is parallel to Israel. So we cannot look to Israel while they were in the land as a model. No nation can claim that status of being God's chosen people I'm not trying to get into eschatology and the role of Israel, with the possible exception of modern day Israel. But we'll set that aside because we're not modern day Israel, so it has no bearing on us.
And
right?
the Vatican.
The only what's that?
And the Vatican. Vatican City.
Okay, false. The only parallel is between Israel and the church. That's where we see, I think, the parallel. Yep.
I get the one thing I would add to that is the covenant, which maybe you're going to say, but like Israel has a direct covenant with God, and like America does not have a direct covenant with God.
Yep.
So.
Nope, I wasn't going to add that, but that's perfect. That's where this derives from, right? That covenant that they have specifically, going back to Abraham, and then Moses also, and obviously then David. Okay? So we have to look, if we're looking to the Bible, we have to look for a different paradigm. And we can look to Abraham when he was on his sojourn, before he had settled in the land and occupied the land. We can look to Joseph when he was in the foreign land of Egypt, and especially Israel in exile. So, we can ask questions. How did they understand their role with Babylon, with Egypt, with Assyria, Persia, or Rome? And they lived differently than they did when they were in the land, in this theocracy. They didn't try to turn Babylon into Jerusalem. And there's no indication that they were working towards that goal of trying to, this is a bad way to say it, Christianize, right? Or Babylon. I know they weren't Christians, that's why it's a bad way to say it. But they weren't trying to transform Babylon into the city of God. No indications of that. They maintained their faithfulness to their religion while living in a foreign land. They worked for the good of the city, as did Joseph. But they longed for their real home. They longed to go back to Jerusalem. I think the parallel there is, we work for the good of the city that we're in, but we understand it's never going to be the city of God. It's never going to be that heavenly Jerusalem, and so we ought to continue longing for that. The New Testament writers do affirm that this is kind of our position in the world, especially Peter, right? Peter refers to us as aliens and strangers or sojourners, but it's not just Peter. Paul refers to our citizenship being truly in heaven. The author of Hebrews says similar kind of things. This isn't our kingdom. We're looking for we're members of an unshakable kingdom. So I think the New Testament affirms that we are sojourners and aliens, and then points us back to that model of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Joseph, Abraham, Israel in exile. So if we can't look to kind of the Old Testament Israel and the land as a model, there is still the Noahic covenant, which we've talked about. In the Noahic covenant, God reestablishes and affirms and commits to preserve the created order. And from the created order, we can deduce kind of a moral order, the way things ought to be, the way God designed them to be, and moral laws that establish that. This is very simple. When you look at the Noahic covenant, I'm not saying that the Noahic covenant contains everything that we ought to use to construct our government systems, our social life together. It's not that. It's a bare minimum kind of framework is probably the best word. It doesn't give us guidance in policy making, but it does give us the kind of the bedrock of this is what government and these are what common institutions look like. We've talked about briefly kind of three different institutions that are implied in the Noahic covenant. There's the family institution, right? Be fruitful and multiply. To be fruitful and multiply, you have to have families that are reproducing. And not just reproducing, but then allowing their kids to grow to maturity and also reproduce. So there has to be these kind of family structures that not only facilitate reproduction, but nurture of children. And there was at least a foundation laid for kind of enterprise and commerce and institutions that would be required for humanity to fill the globe and still feed itself and clothe itself and things like that. And then you do see the beginnings, the rudimentary beginnings of government and judicial institutions. Someone who sheds human blood, of him, his blood will be required. It's setting up the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of retributive justice. As mankind grows, it's going to be increasingly impractical and dangerous for me to go out and individually try to establish and extract that kind of justice. So I think it implies that there's going to be these structures that will do that. Now, this is a very minimalistic approach to government and social structures, right? I think sometimes
That's what I said.
we as Christians are a little bit guilty of allowing the better to be enemies of the good. We have a better vision of what society can and should look like because of the gospel. And sometimes we allow that vision to kind of superimpose itself on the world, and we try to make the world that, and in our quest to make it that, we miss out on just the opportunity to make it good. We're trying to make it something it can't be, and we miss out on just allowing it to be good. Okay. One of the things that we maybe miss when we look at the Noahic covenant is its openness, I guess, to everybody, and the idea that pluralism is preserved and protected under the Noahic covenant. These institutions are open to everybody. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean my specific family is open to everybody, right? But the institution of family and government, judicial structures are not limited to one people, one creed, one race. It's universal. Matter of fact, the covenant is with all of God's creation, so it includes all peoples. And we have to understand, understand and embrace that. Government is for all peoples. So there ought to be equal access, talking specifically of the judicial part of the Noahic covenant, equal access to public courts and equal treatment in all the public courts. I think you can find that in the Noahic covenant. It is, though, broadly pluralistic, and it's held together by here's your, Bill, this is a very minimalistic view of the common good. In the Noahic covenant, in the kind of sense of common community, we don't get this beautiful picture of what community and social structures can and look like. We don't get a picture of kind of communal flourishing. It is a bare, minimalistic approach to righting wrongs and preserving peace. But it is a peace where people aren't excluded on the basis of creed or racial identity. And it does demand a high level of tolerance. In this kind of paradigm, we have to understand that we live in a sinful world, and we as Christians will have to tolerate much that we wouldn't and shouldn't approve of. Okay.
I just feel it weird to go from the Noahic covenant to get to a understanding of common good and natural law. It just, I don't know that the Christian tradition, the Protestant tradition even, has done that historically. I feel like
Right.
if
Nope.
David Van Drunen does it,
Yep.
but it seems like you can get to that. Natural law is like a basic philosophical concept.
I agree.
Aristotle talked about it, other people talked about it, so it's kind of a, like it's good to look biblically and say, oh, this kind of backs that up and fits, but I think it's hard to reason from, there's nothing in there about creed or racial identity. There's only one family.
Right,
So
absolutely. Yep.
I don't know, it's
Yeah.
awkward to me.
I'm reading this Noahic covenant,
Yep.
and
I'm
that seems like a stretch.
no, I'm misspeaking. I'm not saying natural law is rooted in the Noahic covenant.
Okay.
I'm saying the Noahic covenant preserved the natural order and allows us to then look at the natural order, including, right, the Noahic covenant preserves us as humanity, and in our humanity, in the image of God, our consciences speak. We can look at the natural order which has been preserved, it's not underwater right now, and deduce things about natural law because of the Noahic covenant.
Okay.
Now, I think that is well in line with the kind of Christian tradition. I think also in line with the Christian tradition, going back, to maybe even Augustine, is the idea that you see the roots of government in the Noahic covenant. That's the first time you kind of see this retributive justice where mankind is given the mandate because they're in the image of God to do this. And in the Noahic covenant, it is so I'm not looking to the Noahic covenant for natural law, but it preserves natural law. And as it's establishing government, which I think you do see there, it's a very minimalistic approach. Does that clarify?
I guess so.
It doesn't mean we agree, but it's
Okay.
a statement.
So yeah, push back, please, on what part you don't agree with. I don't know if you've read David Van
I haven't
Drunen.
actually. So,
He way over. I got done with his book, and I'm like, I'm so sick of hearing the Noahic covenant
yeah, I read
because I
reviews.
think he way overdoes it. The basic point, which he should have made and then just kind of moved on, is the Noahic covenant preserves the created order, so now we can look to it for natural law. Okay. And you're right. You don't see anything about other nations, but they're not excluded. Obviously, there aren't there yet, but this is a covenant that is supposed to be for all time, right? Well, not exactly, because it does have an expiration date. But God anticipating that the earth would be filled again, there isn't anything about excluding races or creeds or anything like that.
Or including.
Right. Yep. Jerry.
This has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I've never seen it before. After God wiped out the earth because all this sinful,
Yeah.
the first thing Noah does is plant grapes and get plastered.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
the very first thing he does.
Yeah. So
Word.
the flood did not cure the sin problem,
No.
right? Good. Okay, so we have to, this approach really does demand tolerance, and I would just emphasize, not tolerance until we can, wrest control of the Senate or the House from the other party and then pass the laws that we want. Tolerance until Christ comes and institutes the eternal kingdom. We're always going to have to tolerate things that we shouldn't approve of. Okay. So, okay, that was fun. We just said a lot of this, right? So it's not, the Noahic covenant isn't the basis for natural law, but it preserved the natural order so we can deduce. But again, it's minimalistic. And I would say that not everything that can be argued from natural law ought to find its way into legal code. The example that's popping into mind is the Roman Catholic Church makes a great case for refusing birth control from natural law. I don't think governments ought to make laws outlawing birth control because it can be reasoned, I think quite successfully actually, from natural law. So not everything that you can deduce from natural law ought to find its way into the legal code, but what is necessary for humanity to continue to preserve itself and its social structures. The Noahic covenant is a covenant of preservation. So government is given to preserve peace so that we can kind of engage in flourishing activity. This is a quote, I didn't put his name, from David Van Drunen. By affirming a modest vision of the common good, a political community is to maintain both a peaceful coexistence and a broad pluralism in which individuals and institutions can pursue their own richer notions of the common good. So, Bill, this is kind of the essence of your question. I don't think the Noahic covenant gives us any kind of vision for the common good. And in a broadly pluralistic society, there is no shared vision of what the common good is. So absent that, we go for a very minimalistic kind of expression of the common good. We're not killing each other. And government then keeps that peace and allows us each individually to pursue the common good as we understand it, or institutions like the church to pursue the common good. Okay? Now, when there's instances where my vision of the common good conflicts with Mike's, government's going to have to mediate those kind of conflicts and keep the peace. So if my idea of the good is owning his Harley and his idea is he gets to keep it, laws are established. Okay. We're rapidly running out of time. So again, I do think I can make a case from the Noahic covenant that government ought to remain small and limited, partly because there's other institutions that are advanced in the Noahic covenant. For example, family. There are limits because family is a legitimate institution. Government shouldn't encroach on family then. It's overstepping its bounds and infringing upon another good institution that God has ordained.
And your base is going to be fruitful and multiply?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Be fruitful and multiply establishes family.
Okay.
Yep. As does the created, again, natural law, the created order. God created husband and wife, male and female.
Yeah.
They abandon all other relationships. So it's not just the Noahic covenant
Okay.
that preserves family
Okay.
and reaffirms family, but it goes back to the created order.
I'm just
But-
scratching my head.
Just okay. Good,
I won't-
because we
I won't
don't.
let that happen again.
So what happens if one of them, the preservation and whatever the family, comes up against not treating people well in the family?
Right.
Or repeatedly having child after child after child and abusing them prenatally and postnatally and.
Yeah. So I think the idea that of I don't have a slide for this.
I'll bet not.
Because that was an illustration of harm. Government ought to enforce the kind of do no harm, kind of basic minimal ethic. That is so slippery, though, that I would say, again, the most minimalistic, basic understanding of harm is what's important. And the lines get really, when government goes too far, it encroaches, and then you have all these kind of exemptions too, right? So back in the 70s, there was a case Yoder versus Wisconsin, where the government was enforcing every child has to be enrolled in a public school, and the Amish community was saying, whoa, time out, no. And so as government increases its size and reach, it also has to increase the number of exemptions it's giving out. That also is slippery. Who's to say what is a legitimate exemption for religious reasons and what isn't? And so, Hobby Lobby recently, and the healthcare debate was another instance of that. And as government grows, those kind of conflicts are bound to happen more and more. Oh wow, this was going to be like a 15-minute segment all on its own. So I think in the Noahic covenant, you do see retributive justice established, the lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. As the Old Testament interprets that, that also includes compensatory or rectifying kind of justice, where, okay, you gouged out my eye, taking your eye isn't really going to help me, so give me 1,000 drachma. that might be way, I have no idea what 1,000 drachma would be equivalent to. So, but there is also instances where it's going to require forbearance, where we're not going to be able to get justice, and we have to wait for God to finally establish that. Okay, skip all this, forget it, it's not even there. Natural law, I think, helps us establish the idea of kind of natural, negative human rights, which is equivalent to liberty. I don't know that it really does anything to establish positive human rights. I think that's an important distinction. A negative human right would be one that is for everybody at all times, like the right to life, right? A positive human right, the kind of things that you see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like the right to health care, the right to paid holidays, I don't think you can establish those from natural law. When one claims that there is a right, there should be no need to ask how much, how often, from whom. The answer is always from everyone, for everyone, all the time. That's a natural human right. I'm moving so fast, this is not even making sense anymore, right?
Yeah. Because I got a sign, right? If those natural rights apply to everybody, I shouldn't be able to tell my son what to do.
Okay. What natural rights?
His freedoms to make his own choices about his life.
Okay,
And,
gotcha.
You know, I have authority to limit that. And
Yep. But the right to life, you don't have the authority to limit.
I wish for it sometimes.
Justice, I will fight for your right to live. But for example, education. You know, there's often everyone has the right to an education. Well, how much education? What standard of education? You know, that's where it starts to get really fuzzy, and I would push back and say that establishing those kind of rights is probably beyond the pale of government. It might be
But if we decide we're going to do that,
right.
and that's where I'm going to push back up against your government should be limited and small, because if we decide, yeah, we want our government to provide these things, if we decide that, then we have the freedom to decide to do that.
Okay.
And so if we decide we want our government to provide for health care so that our businesses really can truly compete with other
Sure.
countries, because they're not also trying to create this healthcare thing for everybody. If we say we want our government to do that, then we have the freedom to do that.
And I think
if we say we want our government to put in infrastructure, build infrastructure in our country, then we have the freedom to do that.
Okay. I would say there's a difference between provide for and mandate. So when you mandate that everyone has to do this and this, I think you're overstepping. When you provide the opportunity for people to do this and this, I don't think that you are. And there is a definite difference between a natural right and a political right. I have the political right to own a gun. I have no natural right to do that, right? You cannot look to natural law and say, Dan
say defend yourself.
Defend yourself, right. But own a shotgun, no, you can't. So there's a difference between political rights that we have been granted because we, the people, have given them to each other, and natural human rights because we're endowed with them by our Creator. Okay, we have to end. I wish I had like 3 more weeks. Here is my enduring question. Is natural law sufficient? I'll leave you with that. No. As I've read Calvin and Luther and natural law theologians, so many of them say, as is everywhere understood, X is the case. Like adultery is immoral and should be, forbidden. That kind of common vision of even that minimalistic good is so eroded, I don't know that natural law can bear the weight of what Calvin and others foist upon it. I think that's our best approach when reasoning in the public square to be arguing from natural law and not from the Bible says. But I am increasingly worried that it's going to win the argument. When you can't look around and say, well, every nation is doing it. You can't look around and say every nation has some form of retributive justice. Beyond that, there's not much else that every nation has.
Oh, well,
And should we have retributive justice? I mean, is that really the purpose of our court system? If justice is
I would say,
defined by a moral set of what's right and wrong, then I'm not sure that we can say that that is the purpose of our court system in a pluralistic society.
I think based on natural law, I would make the argument that retributive justice is baked in to God's created order. Even 2-year-olds, right, tattle when someone's done something wrong. There's a kind of innate sense that they ought to be punished now. They've broken the rules. So, Stephen, I thought I saw something.
no, I wasn't. I have many thoughts, but no.
Okay. So we do have to end. We did not answer all the questions. I hope we've given kind of a framework to continue thinking about these really hard political questions. So go out, be humble, be involved, and I would say be modest in your expectations of what can and will happen, even in the best scenarios in the American political system.
That's the best part.
Okay, and that's how I will end. So,
Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. If you have questions, feel free to email me. Stephen, I'm anticipating a very long email. All right, have a good morning in worship.